So here is our verse for today, which should be Canto 3, Chapter 15, Text 47. Tam tvam vidam bhagavan, Tam tvam vidama bhagavan paramatma tattvam. Tang tang vidama bhagavan paramam atma tattvam. Satvena sampratiratim rachayantam esham. Satvena sampratiratim rachayantam esham. Yat te nutapa viditar dridhi bhakti yogair. Yat te nutapa viditar dridha bhakti yogair. Udgrantayo hridi vidur munayo viraga. Udgrantayo hridi vidur munayo viraga. Tam tvam vidama bhagavan paramatma tattvam. Satvena sampratiratim rachayantam esham. Yatte nutapa viditar dridha bhakti yogair. Udgrantayo hridi vidur munayo viraga. Tang tang vidama bhagavan paramatma tattvam. Satvena sampratiratim rachayantam esham. Yatte nutapa viditar dridha bhakti yogair. Udgrantayo vidi vidur munayo viraga.
Tam tvam vidama bhagavan param atma tattvam.
Tang tam vidama bhagavan param atma tattvam.
Satvena sampratiratim rachayantam esham.
Satvena sampratiratim rachayantam esham. Yatte nutapa viditar dridha bhakti yogair. Udgrantayo hridi vidur munayo viraga. Tang tam vidama bhagavan paramatma tattvam. Satvena sampratiratim rachayantam esham. Tatte nutapa viditar dridha bhakti yogair. Udgrantayo hridi vidur munayo viraga. Vaishnavis. Tang tam vidama bhagavan paramatma tattvam. Satvena sampratiratim rachayantam esham. Tatte nutapa viditar dridha bhakti yogair. Udgrantayo hridi vidur munayo viraga. Tvam, him. Tvam, you. Vidama, we know. Bhagavan, O Supreme Personality of Godhead. Param, the Supreme. Atma Tattvam, absolute truth. Satvenam, by your form of pure goodness.
by your form of pure goodness.
Samprati, now. Ratim, love of God. Rachayantam, creating. Esham, all of them. Yat, which. Te, your. Anutapa, mercy. Viditai, understood. Drudha, unflinching. Bhakti yogai, through devotional service. Udgrantayaha, without attachment, free from material bondage. Hridi, in the heart. Viduhu, understood. Munayaha, great sages. Viraga, not interested in material life. So the translation reads, we know that you are the supreme absolute truth, the personality of Godhead, who manifests his transcendental form in the uncontaminated mode of pure goodness. This transcendental eternal form of your personality can be understood only by your mercy, through unflinching devotional service by great sages whose hearts have been purified in the devotional way. So, responsively, we know that you are the supreme absolute truth.
We know that you are the supreme absolute truth,
The personality of Godhead, who manifests his transcendental form in the uncontaminated mode of pure goodness. This transcendental eternal form of your personality can be understood only by your mercy, through unflinching devotional service, by great sages whose hearts have been purified in the devotional way. Okay, so here is the purport. The absolute truth can be understood in three features: impersonal Brahman, localized Paramatma, and Bhagavan, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Here it is admitted that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the last word in understanding the absolute truth. Even though the four Kumaras were instructed by their great learned father Brahma, they could not actually understand the absolute truth. They could only understand the supreme absolute truth when they saw personally the personality of Godhead with their own eyes. In other words, if one sees or understands the supreme personality of Godhead, the other two features of the absolute truth, namely impersonal Brahman and localized Paramatma, are also automatically understood. Therefore, the Kumaras confirm you are the ultimate absolute truth. The impersonalist may argue that since the Supreme Personality of Godhead was so nicely decorated, he was therefore not the absolute truth. But here it is confirmed that all the variegatedness of the absolute platform is constituted of Suddha Sattva, pure goodness. In the material world, any quality, goodness, passion, or ignorance, is contaminated. Even the quality of goodness here in the material world is not free from tinges of passion and ignorance. But in the transcendental world, only pure goodness without any tinge of passion or ignorance exists. Therefore, the form of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and his variegated pastimes and paraphernalia are all pure sattva gun. Such variegatedness in pure goodness is exhibited eternally by the Lord for the satisfaction of the devotee. The devotee does not want to see the Supreme Personality of absolute truth in voidness or impersonalism. In one sense, absolute transcendental variegatedness is meant only for the devotees and not for others, because this distinct feature of the transcendental variegatedness can be understood only by the mercy of the Supreme Lord and not by mental speculation or the ascending process. It is said that one can understand the Supreme Personality of God when one is even slightly favored by him. Otherwise, without his mercy, a man may speculate for thousands of years and not understand what is actually the absolute truth. This mercy can be perceived by the devotee when he is completely free from contamination. It is stated, therefore, that only when all contamination is rooted out and the devotee is completely detached from material attractions can he receive the mercy of the Lord, or this mercy of the Lord. Tang tvam vidama bhagavan paramatma tattvam satvena sampratiratiam rachayantam esham yatte nutapa viditar drdha bhakti yogar udgrantayo hrividur munayo viraga. We know that you are the Supreme Absolute Truth, the Personality of Godhead, who manifests his transcendental form in the uncontaminated mode of pure goodness. This transcendental eternal form of your personality can be understood only by your mercy through unflinching devotional service, by great sages whose hearts have been purified in the devotional way. So we can understand a great deal about a person by their conception of God. And there are many different conceptions of God in our world. And of course, by conceptions of God, I also include those conceptions which eliminate God altogether. So all these are in one sense a conception of God, even if one thinks of God as something that doesn't exist, or thinks of God in a abstract or kind of only conceptual sense. So we, of course, in the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, we hear Vedanti tat tattva vidhas tattvam yajnanam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavan iti shabdyate. That there are three features of the Supreme. And those features are Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. And here we're learning that of those, Bhagavan is the primary feature. In Bhagavad Gita, we hear a kind of idea of what's called the yoga ladder, where there is a gradual progression toward purification and a gradual focus on the real bullseye of what spiritual life is about. And what is the real bullseye of spiritual life? It is the Bhagavan feature, developing a personal and intimate relationship with the Bhagavan feature. We do not discount the Brahman feature nor the Paramatma feature, but as we see, the four Kumaras have already experienced very deeply the Brahman feature. And once having come in contact with the Bhagavan feature, actually the Supreme Lord, in a form with, arms and legs and face and clothes and opulences, that they were no longer interested. We don't find that they said, oh, that's cool, we saw the Lord in Vaikuntha, we'll see you, Jaya and Vijaya, we're going to go back and do some meditation, They didn't do that. Somebody mentioned that yesterday, or maybe it was some little while back, that we don't find people who were given the realization of the Supreme Lord's personal form and then opted back into the Brahman feature, or for that matter, even the Paramatma feature. So these different conceptions or these different realizations have a certain emotional impact. So we have vision, the facility of sight. We can see things. And our sight is usually focused on the external world. We can envisage things within ourselves. And of course, when we're dreaming, our eyes are closed, but we see a whole world, even though we're not focused on the outside. So generally, our vision sense is focused on the outside. And our hearing generally is also focused on the outside, though one can hear internal sounds. In fact, there are kinds of yogic meditation which try to elicit or connect with these internal sounds. And of course, we can hear internally. And we have the faculty of taste. And of course, taste is something that basically we only experience internally for the most part. We're tasting things on our tongues as they're going down our mouth, into our digestive alimentary canal. And odors too, although they exist outside, we experience them inside. And so I actually had one experience where I remembered smelling something in a dream, but generally I don't think I have much going on in my dreams with odors, but I do remember one time, actually strangely enough, I dreamed coming into this temple room right through that door, and I smelled something, and that was what struck me. And then when I woke up, I immediately thought, wow, there's a dream where I actually smelled something, But at any rate, odors generally also do not occur much internally. Now, the faculty of touch, there's something which is really quite prominent internally. That we, of course, touch things, hard, soft, hot, cold, rough, smooth. We have these kind of experiences. But really what feeling is about, and we use the same descriptive human language for it. We say we feel good, we feel bad, we feel happy, we feel sad. So we say that in the same way as we say the rock felt hard, the rock felt rough. So we felt we had a rough morning, so inside that mysterious continent within ourselves, the great within, is full of feelings. We experience them quite often, and there's nothing too esoteric about it, We find that there are so many men or so many women in the world, but, most people find one man or one woman who is somehow very special, although there are so many others, So when we come into contact with something or someone that's very special, that internal experience of feeling becomes awakened in a way that is really not like any other thing. It's very different. And so the four Kumaras, they had experienced the Brahmananda, the bliss of Brahman. But when they experienced the visage, the form of the Supreme, along with, as we see, whenever the Supreme Lord is there, he also carries not only an entourage, but like an entire mood with him, especially if you're open to that mood. Of course, one has to be open. So these things are hinted at in this verse, that they saw him in the transcendental mode of goodness. So the four Kumaras saw the Supreme Lord, and they could immediately appreciate the transcendental mode of goodness that he brought with him, that it was not partly co-opted with tinges of passion and ignorance like it is in the material world. And because they were primed, they were favorable to the Supreme, immediately they were captivated. As, let's compare, like Duryodhana, who also had the darshan of the Supreme Lord, didn't do much for Duryodhana. In fact, Duryodhana was kind of annoyed with the presence of the Supreme Lord. He wished that he would just disappear or something, So this shows that someone can be in the proximity of the Supreme Lord and have nothing going on inside, or something even kind of negative going on inside. And of course, there, as we hear in Srimad Bhagavatam in the Krishna book, that when Krishna and Balaram came into Mathura, some saw him as they saw them as the most beautiful boys. Some saw Krishna as death personified. Some saw Krishna as, the most expert of cheaters. There are all these different perceptions that people had depending on their orientation towards the Supreme. So the four Kumaras are going through a transcendental progression. They're going through they're going through a progressive internal purification, where now when they see the Supreme, they've heard that the Supreme exists, but they only heard it from their father, Brahma. And now they're actually experiencing the Supreme. And when they experience the Supreme by vision, internally something is going on. They're feeling something. And that feeling is a great, incredible experience which they immediately recognize. There are some things which do not require proof. They do not require any description. I mean, one can try to describe them, but if you experience the connection with the Supreme Lord, there's nobody that can tell you that you didn't experience it. Now, someone can say those kind of words, but they're meaningless, because they're telling you didn't experience what you just experienced. So such things are like saying that wall isn't yellow when we know it's yellow. We're looking at it right now, So just to deny such a thing makes no sense, and it has no purpose. So the four Kumaras had this very intense experience, and for them, they realized now here is the Supreme Lord. We've heard about him, now we've experienced him, and we realized what these bhaktas have been talking about. We've heard that there is this literature in the Vedic theme, that there are various descriptions of the Supreme Lord and how the bhaktas relate to him. And we ourselves have been given this notion by our father Brahma that the Supreme Lord is a person and not just the Brahman. So now we've met that person and we realize that experience trumps anything we ever heard or experienced with Brahman. So we're no longer interested in Brahman. We've moved on to a new realization. We've moved on to a new four Kumaras. We're no longer the same four Kumaras that we were before. And this is the same thing that happens to every living entity at some point in their lives, one lifetime or another, where they finally come to realize the Supreme Lord and all misgivings are put aside. We have an experience that is like no other. We no longer want to retreat or move off to some other segued realization or segued, segue into some other, position, to some other location, to some other experience. We're happy. This is it. We're at the top. Just like when people really feel enormously happy, it's not like, okay, now I'm happy, so let me go change the oil in my car or something like that. It's not like you want to do something else. You just want to be there. And so this is this amazing nature. And it's really interesting that in Unveiling His Lotus Feet, this book by Burijan, it makes quite a focus on this verse, the previous one and this one. It describes that Jiva Goswami in his Priti Sandarbha, in the previous verse, he describes that the four Kumaras had experienced what he calls sthaibhav in the impersonal realization, which I was kind of taken aback by. I didn't know you could have sthaibhav in Brahman realization. So what is described as sthaibhav is the sort of happiness or bliss that just exists. It doesn't come and go. It doesn't fade in and fade out. It's sort of like the base platform. So a person who is fixed in at least Brahman realization and has no material desires, such a person is in a type of sthaibhav. And so this is what he claims is the situation of the four Kumaras, that this is quite an interesting and detailed section here. He says that Priti Sandarbha Anucheda 203 cites this verse to illustrate the sthaibhava of a Gyan Bhakta who has been attached to the impersonal Brahman. So this indicates that the Kumara's association with the Lord elevated them from impersonalists to bhaktas in Santaras. So this is the first thing, and this particular aspect was discussed or was hinted at in the previous verse that was read yesterday by Radhisham. So today's verse is where we find this notion of the four Kumaras transforming into bhaktas. And Burijan describes it through the words of Jiva Goswami, saying that Jiva Goswami is describing like a conversation going on between the Supreme Lord and the four Kumaras. And the Supreme Lord's telling them, my dear four Kumaras, did not your father Brahma tell you that the Supreme is impersonal and the highest? So therefore, you're seeing me, I must be something else. This is how Jiva Goswami puts it. And the four Kumaras challenge that. And they say, no. And they're quoting from this verse, you are that supreme absolute truth. So if somebody would challenge that, well, actually it must be the impersonal is the highest, but the four Kumaras, who are very schooled in the impersonal Brahman, are saying, no, you are that same Brahman. However, you are manifest now before us in a form with all kinds of paraphernalia and accoutrements of various kinds and entourage, etc. So I like to read it because it actually, I'm not doing it justice, I feel, so let me read it here. So this is the Bhagavat Sandarbha, Anucheta 78, where Jiva Goswami adds the details to exchange between the Kumaras and the Lord. At this point, Lord Narayan may object, has not your father taught you that the absolute truth is invisible and secret? Because I, Narayan, am now openly visible before your eyes, I therefore cannot be that absolute truth. I must be something else. The Kumars reject the idea that Lord Narayan is different from the absolute truth. They say in text 47, O Supreme Personality Bhagavan, we know, Vidama, that you are the same Supreme Absolute Truth, Param Atma Tattvam, whose form is spiritual. Lord Narayan may then ask, how do you know? The Kumaras may then reply, we know because you have now samprati manifest your transcendental form before us in the uncontaminated mode of pure goodness, sattva. So these Sanskrit words are all from this verse that we just read. Until this moment we did not understand you, but now we can see you directly. We have concluded that you are the Supreme. You are visible to our eyes just as Brahman, appearing in the functioning of a pure heart. In other words, you are not perceived as a material object of vision. The four Kumaras continue, you are not known through transcendental knowledge, devoid of love for you. You have created rachayitam, our love, ratim, for you. For otherwise we could not love you. You are better than Brahman, because by your appearance we have attained ratim, attachment to you. We could not be attached to your form if it were material. So to kind of sum up what's going on there, the four Kumaras are explaining in this verse that we're reading today that the Supreme Lord is that same Supreme Brahman, but that their knowledge up to this point was only of Brahman, and therefore they know that their change of heart, their transformation can only have taken place because the Supreme Lord blessed them with knowledge because of their sincerity. So we hear this thing that one needs both sincerity and the mercy of the Lord. We need both things. That if the Supreme Lord had not benedicted the four Kumaras, they could not have understood who he was. Similarly, if the four Kumaras had not been to some extent sincere and following the actual process of bhakti, then the Supreme Lord wouldn't have bothered to benedict them. So because of these two things, they were given this not only vision of the Supreme Lord, but this internal experience of the Supreme Lord being the Supreme. So in this way it is with all of us, that we need to follow the right path, how to awaken our devotion, and then we have to wait for the mercy of the Supreme. Both things must be there. And this is why most people are not headed towards spiritual life, or much less this understanding of the Bhagavan feature. Most people are not headed that way because they are not really fully pure, nor are they interested. If they have some knowledge, some esoteric, spiritual knowledge, it's usually not about service and understanding the Supreme. It's about something else. And so therefore, like the Kumaras up till this point, they would never have gotten this experience. But because evidently they heard from their father, they were going to check out the possibility, and they were trying to meet the Supreme, which shows that they were serving the Supreme. They were trying to go to where the Supreme was, namely Vaikuntha. And of course they'd been blocked by the four Kumaras, but it didn't matter because the Supreme Lord came to them. And so therefore, these four Kumaras had now undergone a very intense transformation which would change them forever, as it will anybody. Anyone who finally melts away that last, contamination of material desire and material focus and comes in contact with Supreme, such a person will never be the same. Such a person will never lapse back into material life. But such a position is also very high. So that's what we are working towards through the process of devotion. So we have both the knowledge of how to do it and the right intention. So with the right intention and the knowledge to do it, eventually we'll get the important ingredient of the mercy of the Supreme Lord. So there's a whole bunch more I wanted to say, but we're going to have to just put that off and ask if there are any questions about what we've just discussed at this point. You want to get the little microphone out so that our friends out there in YouTube Loka can hear. Yes.
Thank you, Maharaj, for the class. I had a question about, towards the end of the class you were mentioning about there's these two aspects of your personal endeavor and mercy. And could you elaborate a little bit more about how we balance these two? That because I heard you're supposed to get the mercy when you can, but actually mercy, it's a very it's not something that we can somewhat rely on because it may descend, it may not descend. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to understand that.
Right. I kind of think of it, I came up with a metaphor, For instance, say a school decides to do a trip with all the students, So the teachers say, okay, on Tuesday, we're going to go on a field trip. We're going to go wherever it is, And the students are young. They're, like 5 and 6 years old in that age bracket. So the teacher then asks, which students want to go? The students who don't want to go, they can just not come to school that day or whatever it is because it's going to take the whole day. We're going on the trip. So it's kind of like that the students themselves don't have the capacity to go to the park or the aquarium or the, whatever it is that they're going to visit, the Aerospace Museum or the Museum of Science and Industry or whatever it is. They don't have the ability to go do it. But they do have the ability to desire and manifest that desire to the teachers. And those students who don't raise their hand, who just as soon stay in bed all day, they won't be going, But the others who do raise their hands, then the teachers will make the arrangement for their lunch and for their bus trip and, admission or whatever it's going to cost, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of like that we will not get the mercy of the Lord if we have no interest in getting it. Similarly, if we are serious about getting the mercy of the Lord, it behooves us to understand what it takes. And then we start to engage in the process, that it is involved in pleasing the Supreme Lord. We may do it imperfectly, and certainly we will. That's all right. However, we are sincerely trying, and we're working against our previous bad habits. And if we persist, at some time down the line, the Supreme Lord will pay off the balance. It's kind of like the balloon payment on the mortgage. We're doing so many, installments, and we're getting there, but finally the Supreme Lord pays off the final balloon payment, and we're there. So generally, the way it works is that when you have done as much as you can, at some point the Supreme Lord is merciful and bestows the divine realization of himself and devotional service in the process of bliss that comes from engaging in the Supreme Lord's service. He bestows that. So it just basically works like that. It's actually the mercy of the Lord. We couldn't make it without the mercy of the Lord. But at the same time, if we're not eager, if we're not making any, effort from our part, we're not going to get that mercy. We won't just be walking down the street and trip over a crack in the sidewalk and get love of God. It doesn't work like that. It's a person who is serious about love of God will find out what it takes to try to get it, and then they will, like the four Kumaras, engage in the process of what we call sadhana. As Burijan says in this Surrender Unto Me, in this chapter, he says that love of God is the mature fruit of sadhana. So if we are engaging in our sadhana, it may be imperfect, it may be sometimes compromised, or there may be various hiatuses, but as long as we're moving forward, the Supreme Lord will eventually shower his mercy on such an individual. Of course, that's basically how I would describe it.
Thank you, Maharaj. I just had one. I'm not trying to be devil's advocate,
right,
but I feel like the Srimad Bhagavatam has so many exceptional cases of we see the rule and then we see the exception. I feel the Bhagavatam is highlighting the exceptions, like a Jamil, did everything. He had no sadhana, no anything. The mercy flowed down on him, and then Putana just had no sadhana, maybe the sadhana of killing babies, but nothing else. How do we explain?
How do we explain that? Well, it's a good question. I think it's an important question too. Usually we find that there's something a little bit more to it than we generally meets the eye. Often what we hear is how easy it is sometimes to get the Lord's mercy, even sometimes inadvertently, like for instance Ajamil, by chance, well not by chance, but by his bereavement from leaving behind his son, calling out his son's name, but it just so happened his son's name happened to be a name of Vishnu, as is the case for most children. If you're born in India, you get some name of Vishnu, or something like that, or a devotee of Vishnu. And similarly, if you're born in the Western world, you get some name of Jesus or one of his followers or some name of God. That's what all the other names are. So he called out that name, and as a result, he was purified. So what we discover is that when Ajamil was delivered, he didn't actually go back right away. He had to go to Hardwar, and he engaged in penance and kind of, paid off the last of his debt. And it wasn't that he had no sadhana. He did have sadhana, but he fell down from his practice. So that was there too. Now there's another thing that figures in here, and very importantly, and that is the mercy of the devotees. That generally speaking, most people are neither interested in nor aware of the Supreme Lord or devotional service or any of these things. So how and why would they ever make any effort for any kind of spiritual life? The bald fact is they wouldn't, And since the Supreme Lord is pledged to give every living entity its free will, so if you're serious about not wanting to have anything to do with God, then Krishna's not going to force himself on such an individual. So what is the hope? There is one hope, and that is that there's a third actor in the scenario here, and that third actor is the devotee of the Lord, who understands the real interest of the wayward and totally confused individual, and attempts to approach them to broker their initial contact with the Supreme Lord when they have no interest in such a thing, And through the desire of the devotee implores the Supreme Lord to give mercy to that totally undeserving, undesiring, entity. And because the devotee interceded, that undeserving, undesiring person was turned. Otherwise, there would have been... That's why Sankirtan is so important. It's the one thing that makes the equation work. Otherwise, it wouldn't. Because otherwise, if people didn't want Krishna, Krishna would just stand there, I mean, he could turn people around, but then where would be free will, But if he didn't do anything and no one wanted to, then everybody would just be going down the merry old road to hell, and there would be no possibility. But because the Sankirtan devotee is an independent actor, he does know the real need and the real well-being, or the real wealth or necessity of the living entity, and he acts on that, even though the living entity himself doesn't know that. Nor is he interested in that, nor has he built up any pious activities or any of those things. In fact, he may have heaped upon, tons and tons of all kinds of sinful things. But the devotee sees past that, and since the devotee is asking Krishna, please, Krishna, this poor, totally unconscious, lost living entity is just going towards hell in a very steep grade downward toward hell. Please help them. So Krishna says, all right, now somebody's asked me to help this person. The person didn't ask. And I wouldn't do it because of free will, but now there's a third person in this mix, there's a third party in the scenario. So that person has asked me, because you, my dear devotee, have asked to help this third person, then I will. So in such a way, the Supreme Lord changes that person's bearing, and they see the light. Of course, they can go right back to sleep, and sometimes they do. But oftentimes when the desire of the devotee is very strong, the devotee brokers that transition from a downward-headed trajectory, a crash landing into hell, to a person finally realizing, wait a minute, I should pull back on the yoke of this airplane and start going back up, and so then the person does that. As Prabhupada said, I made your pious credit. So the person who is canvassing through the material world, trying to help wayward living entities, when they meet somebody and that person is turned, they're the reason why somebody apparently doesn't have anything good going for them, but they've been accepted into the spiritual the category of those who are making spiritual progress, almost completely not as a result of anything on their side, but because there's somebody else. That's kind of the missing piece of the equation.
That helps. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah. Any other final question? Okay. So, thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam. All glories to the devotees of the Lord and the wondrous devotional service that they give to all. Hare Krishna.